So the way that this is going to work today is we are going to have a bit of an introduction from Stephen into what citizens' assemblies are and climate assemblies. I'll say a bit about the climate assembly in Scotland. Stephen will then talk about Climate Assembly UK, and we'll finish off with a few lessons that we want to kind of highlight at this time. And then we'll open it up for discussion with you. So you can be posting stuff in the chat. Scott will be keeping an eye on that. And then at the end, you can also just raise your hand or unmute and ask a question as well. So it'll be pretty informal. Anything else? I think that's it. So let's begin.
Thanks, Nadine. Thank you all for coming. So this is a Festival of Social Science event. So these are talks aimed at the general public. So we'll be providing a general overview of what climate assemblies are, about the two cases from Scotland and UK, and trying to draw some lessons from the research that we've been doing. So I've been collaborating with Nadine on research on the Scottish Climate Assembly, and I also led research on Climate Assembly UK, and that's what we'll be covering. So I'm going to start with a discussion about deliberative democracy, which is a theory which has informed the design and development of citizens' assemblies. And deliberative democracy is an approach to democracy about how we should conceive democracy and what democracy actually means. Sometimes citizens' assemblies are equated with deliberative democracy, and that would be a mistake. They're not one and the same thing. In fact, we need lots of different types of institutions. We need deliberation right across the political system to have a deliberative democracy. But citizens' assemblies are one way to try and promote the norms and values of deliberative democracy, which it's an approach really to decision making that when we're making decisions, we should reason together. We shouldn't just make demands, but that we should explain why we want those demands, why we think they're good, why others should accept them. As a result, we should also approach these discussions with an open mind. We shouldn't make up our mind beforehand. We shouldn't stick to what we already think. We should at least reflect on what we already think. Doesn't mean we have to change, but we should reflect on what we think in light of the reasons that other people offer. We should enter these discussions respectfully. So we are willing to genuinely listen to other people have said, that we're willing to consider the reasons that they offer, that we don't dismiss them because of who they are, and we don't dismiss them just because of what they say without having given their thoughts due consideration. And the discussion should be inclusive as well. So everyone should have an equal opportunity to be involved. Why is this considered to be a good approach to democracy? Well, some say it's a very fair process, everybody is included, and others suggest that it would lead to good decisions, either more informed decisions in the sense by having this inclusive, reasoned conversation. We're all pooling the disparate knowledge that is dispersed throughout society, and as a result, the decisions will be more informed and better for it. But also that they're more likely to focus on the common good rather than on the interests of any particular section of society. This is because in this circumstance, if I was to say, oh, let's do this because it's going to be good for me, you would remain unconvinced, unpersuaded. I need to say, let's do this because we're all going to benefit. Now, you then get to judge whether that's a credible claim or not, but at least the conditions will encourage me to have to at least frame the justification that way. And therefore we'll end up with decisions that are more likely to benefit everybody rather than just a section of society. So ultimately, deliberative democracy, it's a theory of legitimacy. It's saying if this stuff doesn't happen, then the decisions aren't legitimate, or certainly less legitimate than they would be if it did. But at the same time, there are a set of conditions that are very, very difficult to meet in practice. It's, you know, if you think about the scale of society, it's very, very difficult to have everybody included in an inclusive conversation. People do have self-interest, people do act self-interestedly, and so therefore it's hard to avoid that. There are other issues that make it difficult to achieve in practice. So next slide, please, Nadine, thanks. And that's problems with political participation. So I take quite a holistic idea of what political participation means. It can be, of course, voting in an election or a referendum. It can be joining a political party. It can be joining an interest group. It can be going on a march. It can be signing a petition. It can be throwing an egg at a politician, but it can also be you know, going to a public hearing and discussing issues with friends and work colleagues, you know, at the pub or in the society or in a club or something. So there's lots of different ways of participating politically, but in general, political participation suffers from these three problems, which also then make it more difficult to have those deliberative values I've just been talking about. So firstly, political participation is demographically skewed. There's just certain types of people who are more likely to be politically active than others, and simply they have more opportunities to be politically active. And so this is why often with political participation, have an open forum and just say anyone can come. It's the usual suspects, the people who participate most frequently that are likely to come. And in general, they are not representative of the population in the types of people that they are. Often political participation is uninformed as well. People don't tend to take the time to become informed about political issues, and especially within some formats of political participation. So if you take opinion polls, which do play a lot of influence on policy and politicians' thinking and strategy and things, people have phoned up or stopped on the street and said, oh, what do you think about this issue? And they may have never given that issue any thought or consideration whatsoever at all. They certainly may not know very much about it, and yet they'll quite often offer an opinion just simply because they've been asked for it. But to what extent is that a good indication of what the public might think about something? And because participation is demographically skewed, it tends to be those who are most interested in the issue, who are often those with most at stake on that particular issue, that are most likely to participate. Because these people do have interest in the issue, they often come with a closed mind. They've already made their mind up, they've already had their opinion set, and they're not going to listen to new information, evidence, or the views of other people. So it can be closed-minded. So because of all these problems, it creates tensions for and barriers to achieving the sort of deliberative society that deliberative Democrats think we need to have a more legitimate democracy. Next slide, please. So while there's many different measures that we might need in order to overcome those problems and barriers, and as I said, certainly citizens' assemblies alone should not be seen as a solution, they have developed as part of a solution to overcome that. And in particular, at the moment in Europe, we're seeing a wave of climate assemblies. So what is a climate assembly? So it's a type of citizen assembly. I can explain more what that is in a moment, but it's a citizen assembly that focuses on an aspect of climate governance. So that can be the big picture, the full thing. How do we address climate change? And we'll see that with more luck with the cases that we're looking at today, or it can be more specific. It could look just at an aspect of climate governance, like how to deal with energy or how to deal with air quality, etc., etc. But then what then is a citizens' assembly? Well, a representative or diverse sample of the public are recruited as participants. And this is done usually through, first of all, random sampling. By doing random sampling, it can give everybody an equal chance of being selected, and hence that's why it's often thought to be a bit like a lottery. But there's usually then stratified sampling. Stratified sampling is then when you make sure that there's certain quotas of types of people depending on their age, depending on their gender, their race, etc. Whatever you think are the key criteria that's important to have included in the assembly. You then set quotas and do stratified sampling to make sure that the final number of participants that you have reflects that balance, and it should be ideally the balance across society as a whole. Now, I say diverse or representative, it's in citizens' assemblies, it's usually about 100 participants. There can be less, particularly if it's a local assembly, or there can be more, but the most common is 100. Statistically, 100 people can't be representative of the whole population, but they do have the same sort of demographic proportions. So that's why it's more about making sure that diversity is there. Other measures are also brought in to try and remove those barriers to political participation. So participants are given a financial reward for participating. This is to make, for the people who would never even consider being politically active, wouldn't, you know, it's just not for them. It's to try and get them involved so we can hear their opinions, which normally are the ones that are excluded. You know, childcare can be provided, accommodation is provided, travel expenses are provided, expenses in general are covered. Again, to make sure that people who wouldn't normally come do come. It's also based on having you know, public opinion research, which is based upon having a sample of participants. And this is what the picture of the chef is there for. So if you're making a soup and you think, oh, I wonder if this soup needs a bit more seasoning, you don't eat the entire pan and go, oh yeah, that could have done with a bit more salt. You'll take a teaspoon, you'll have a taste, and you think, yeah, it needs more seasoning. And you have no reason to think that that teaspoonful, that sample, is representative of what's in the pan as a whole. So the idea is that if you get a good sample of the public together, it can be an indication of what the public as a whole might think in these situations. Once you have your participants, then they're usually given information. I say they're balanced information in the sense that if there's different opinions on an issue, those opinions should be reflected in the information provided. If there's more of a scientific consensus on an issue, then that will be included as well. And it's usually a combination of experts and advocates who provide the information. But the participants get information from each other. They learn from each other as well, because they enter into discussions with each other. And those discussions are facilitated. So there's a moderator there trying to make sure that those norms of deliberation that I spoke about a moment ago are included in the discussion, to make sure that everyone has a say, that it's not just a few people dominating the discussion, to make sure they stay on topic and don't just start discussing, you know, what they're going to have for dinner that night, to make sure that they respect other people's opinions and listen to them and aren't rude and disrespectful towards them, and to make sure that they justify their demands. They don't just say, we should do this. Well, it's why should we do that? Let's hear your explanation. So the facilitation then is to make sure, to at least encourage the discussions to be deliberative. Remember, these are participants who are not usually politically active, or at least a large number of them are not normally politically active. So they're not used to doing this type of thing. They don't necessarily come with these skills at the start. After they've discussed the issues, they then tend to vote and come up with a set of recommendations about what should be done to address the issue that they've been given. And then there's usually a link to some sort of institution. So sometimes they can precede a referendum, so they're advising the public. They do tend to be advisory. It's very rare that they're given decision-making power. So sometimes they advise the public, and the public then vote in the referendum. But more frequently, they advise a government body or parliament, and that's the case in the two cases in Scotland and the UK that we're going to be going on to discuss in today's session. Starting now, over to you, Nadine, with Scotland.
Yeah, so I'm Nadine Andrews, and I'm a social researcher in the Scottish Government. And I'm also a visiting researcher at Lancaster University Centre the Pentland Centre for Sustainability in Business. And so before I kind of say too much about what we found with the Climate Assembly, here's some background about it. So the Climate Change Act 2019 had a regulation for ministers to have a citizens' assembly on climate change. So it was funded by the Scottish Government, and part of the Act was that Scottish ministers had to respond to the recommendations produced by the Assembly within 6 months of receiving the report. So as the report was laid before Parliament in June of this year, that means that the government has by the 23rd of December to respond. In terms of organising the Assembly, there were these four main groups, sorry. So there was the stewarding group, which had sort of oversight of the whole thing. You had a secretariat, which was set up to be independent of the government, but was staffed by seconded civil servants. The design and facilitation team, who were made up of two organisations working together, Involve and DEMSOC, who were brought in for that purpose. And then there was an evidence group. So this was the experts in their fields who then were also involved in bringing in other informants. And these people then presented the evidence to the members. So there was about 105 members of the public that were selected to be in the Assembly. There was a couple, 2 or 3, who left for various reasons, and they were replaced. And most people, almost all, there was only like, you know, a very small number that didn't attend. There was 7 weekends, and there was initially 6, but the members had the option to vote for a 7th weekend, which they then chose to do. And there's a plan for an 8th weekend, which possibly in January or after January, after the Scottish Government response. So that gives you an idea of the setup. And they were tasked with addressing this question. So how should Scotland change to tackle the climate emergency in an effective and fair way? And this question was crafted by the stewarding group. So that's that. Oops. So so there were these 7 weekends. For 3 of the weekends, the members were split into topic streams. So there were 3 topic streams. You can see the topics here: diet, land style and lifestyle, homes and communities, travel and work. And each of these streams then had 4 sub-questions, which they then worked on for these weekends. And then for weekends 6 and 7, they came back together as mixed stream groups. So the members met on a Saturday and a Sunday. So that was the weekend work. So the research then. So the research is a collaboration between Scottish Government, social research, and with Stephen Elstub from Newcastle. And here are our objectives around the research. So this first one here, supporting learning and continuous improvement in the delivery of the Assembly Wilson process. So this was what our focus was when the Assembly was actually happening, producing data that could be of use to them, to make tweaks and improvements, or to continue things which were working. And yeah, so we can talk more about that later if you're interested. And then clearly one of the main objectives then is that the evaluating the success of the Assembly as a deliberative process, assessing the impact of the Assembly on climate change debate in Scotland. And then the two last objectives really relate to contributing learning. As citizens' assemblies and climate assemblies in particular become more popular, and also as there's commitment within the Scottish Government to do more citizens' assemblies, it's vitally important that the learning that we generate is actually put to use and can inform the design of future assemblies, because certainly in Scotland we've just done two at a national level now. There was the Citizens Assembly of Scotland and then this Climate Assembly, so it's still early days and there's a lot to learn. So those were our objectives. Now, in terms of the research itself, so as I said already, it was a collaborative endeavour between Scottish Government Social Research and with Stephen as the external academic. The research is independent of the Secretariat itself and also from Scottish Government policy. And we've taken a mixed methods approach. Now, we're aware that given this event is for the ESRC Festival of Social Science and it's aimed at the general public, there could be people on the call here who are not so familiar with research, the kind of terminology. So I'll do a short explanation here, but if people have got questions and you want to get more information about what all of this means, then please do just ask in the chat and we'll spend a bit more time explaining this. So for mixed methods basically means that we're combining quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative research is about numbers essentially. So, how many, how much, those kinds of questions. And the qualitative stuff, the qualitative research is where you're looking into meaning, really. And so that's more like using interviews to find out what people think and what they feel, and you get more detail about what people mean when they give a particular answer. So we used for our research, we've pulled together multiple data sources, as you can see in this list here, and Stephen will probably say something more about why this is a useful approach. But the sort of the fundamental point is that one data source on its own only gives you a very partial picture. So if you have multiple data sources, then when you integrate those findings together, you build up a more comprehensive picture. It's never the whole picture, but it's you get more perspectives with which to draw conclusions. So so we drew on a whole load of different data sources there, and if anybody's got any questions about that, we can pick that up. The actual research and the report. So we originally were going to publish an interim report for November, and then this talk would have gone into a lot more detail on what was published in that report. Since we scheduled this event, it was decided to just have one full report, which is now going to come out end of March. So what we're able to talk about is a bit more limited, and it's just based on findings that have already been published, and I'll explain about that in a little bit. But in terms of the report, which is coming out in March, this is what is all going to be covered as part of it, and this basically addresses meets our research objectives. So we're looking into the assembly process in terms of its organisation, design and governance, the evidence, and then all about the member participation and learning, the member experience, the support for the Assembly and its recommendations from the members themselves and also the wider public, the impact of the Assembly on climate change debate and policy in Scotland, and then also looking at outcomes for members. So this is a little bit more longer term, not longitudinal research, unfortunately, because we're not able to do that. But you know, the Assembly ended in March of this year, and we'll be doing some more data collection in February, whenever the 8th meeting happens. We can do another member survey then and find out more about what members have been up to in that intervening period. So all of this is in the report, so look out for that when it comes out in March, and Stephen and I will be doing more events after that to talk about what's in that report. So you may want to come back to some of those events. So what I am going to talk about now is just based on findings that have been published, and these are data briefings which we produced, and that goes back to the research objective around supporting continuous learning. So we drew largely on member surveys, which we did. There was a pre-Assembly member survey which was done before the Assembly started, and then after each weekend members then completed a survey, and on average around 2/3 of members completed the survey. So you know, it's just indicative, given that not all of them completed it. And then we produced, we were also doing what's called non-participant observational data, where we were observing their group discussions. And so we combined that data to produce these data briefings, which were largely for internal purposes, for the Secretariat and for the design team, and also the stewarding group. And then that gave them a chance to, if there was anything that was being highlighted, to then, you know, potentially make some tweaks for the following weekend. And 3 of those data briefings were published on the website, and there will be a link in the chat if you want to have a look at those data briefings. So it was for weekend 1, weekend 4, and weekend 7. So just a few key findings which I'll pull out now based on those data briefings. So generally speaking, we saw high levels of member satisfaction and engagement with the Assembly process. So almost all of the respondents to the member surveys were satisfied with the support and the assistance that was provided by the design team and by the Secretariat, communication about the arrangements, the organisation of the weekend, and also felt included and respected by their facilitators. Increase in self-reported knowledge. So, you know, there's a lot more to say about this in the report itself, but even just from the data briefings, we can see, you know, there were some fluctuations, but broadly speaking, we can see increases in people's own self-reported knowledge about climate change and how to tackle it. And also the extent to which they felt that they had the information to address the Assembly question, both for themselves individually and for the Assembly as a whole. Now, Scotland's Climate Assembly was the first national climate assembly to be conducted entirely online, and that does pose particularly challenges for the facilitators. So what we could see for the facilitators, the particular challenges are not only are they trying to manage the actual group discussions and the group dynamics online when you can't read body language as well as you would if you were in person, but they're also responding to all the technical difficulties that are just emerging, as well as completing various and using various online resources like Jamboard, which is like a kind of whiteboard, and various Google Docs, and also taking accurate notes. So they were, you know, juggling a lot of different tasks, using multiple kind of platforms. Now, this fourth point here about this perception of not having enough time, of feeling rushed. So this was a sort of theme that ran throughout the assembly, and not all members, and it did change, week to week, depending. However, there was this feeling. So, for example, in weekend 4, just under half thought that there wasn't enough time in the small groups to develop their recommendations, and in the weekend 7 survey, so this was after the assembly had finished, just over half agreed that there'd been enough time. I'll come back to that point again soon, but we did also observe when we were observing the small group discussions that it did seem like the time was quite limited for really full discussions and opportunities for peer scrutiny and for a very thorough sort of explanation. Okay, and then this final one here around impact on mental health. So I'm also the chair of Climate Psychology Alliance Scotland, and I've got a big interest in the psychological impacts of stuff. And we already know that as people learn about climate change, it's likely that they're going to start encountering feelings like anxiety and other emotions, which can be very difficult to bear. And some people will find it more difficult than others to regulate those emotions in a way that's healthy and that doesn't have a negative impact. So what we found was that there was 4 or 5 or so members that were consistently reporting that their feelings about climate change were having a negative impact on their mental health. And we did actually produce some wellbeing resources for members to support them with them. And as far as I know, this Climate Assembly was the first one to really look at this particular aspect of the psychological impacts for members of learning about the severity of the crisis that we're in. Okay, so in terms of just a few key considerations, as I say, these are just based on what's already been published in the data briefings. There's a lot more that Stephen and I have to say on this topic, which will be in our report. But this first one here is just something which I'm interested in myself. What is enough, given that climate change is there is no bigger topic in terms of its vastness, isn't it, and its complexity for us to confront at the moment. And we can never investigate it in a climate assembly fully. So how much time is enough? And clearly this relates to the remit. The Scotland's Climate Assembly had quite a broad remit, as you've seen in the question that we showed earlier. They went into the topic streams as a way to address that, to be able to get more depth and more coverage. But nevertheless, there was this feeling of there not quite being enough time, of feeling rushed. So how do we decide what enough time is? The second point here about whether members' views are reflected in the finalised outputs. Now, we could see from our data that a large proportion of the survey respondents, at least, did think that their views were reflected. So 8 out of 10 thought that their views were reflected in the. So what we mean by the finalised outputs is what it ended up in the actual report that came from the members. So they had these kind of overarching statements of ambition. They came up with 16 goals, and each of those goals had a set of associated recommendations and supporting statements. And there was 81 recommendations. in total. And there'll be a link in the chat that you can go and have a look at the report if you're not already familiar with that. So, 8 out of 10, it's a good number, but is that good enough? Like, on what basis do we decide whether that's satisfactory or not? Do we want all members to feel that their views are being reflected, or are we happy with 8 out of 10 or less than 8 out of 10? I think these things are still up in the air. And then this point here about the extent to which members are given opportunities to influence decisions, all kinds of decisions, but including about evidence provision. So in Scotland's Climate Assembly, they were given some opportunity to suggest speakers or content. When we asked in the Weekend 7 survey, around 2/3 agreed that they'd had the opportunity to influence decisions about the content. Now, why this other third felt like they hadn't had the opportunity, we don't know. But yeah, so it's still an open question about, well, what other decisions should we be enabling members to be part of, to be able to contribute towards an influence. And then this one here on the topic streams and the impact on members' understanding. So clearly, if you've got an assembly and you're then splitting people up into 3 topic streams, the people in those 3 topic streams are then having different experiences for that time, and they're being exposed to different evidence. Now, with this assembly, they then reintegrated in weekends 6 and 7 into these mixed stream groups. And we asked in the weekend 7 survey whether they felt that they understood the recommendations that had been proposed in their own stream and why they'd been proposed. 9 out of 10 said that they agreed that they did understand. And in terms of whether they understood what had been proposed in the other topic streams and why they'd been proposed, that was 8 out of 10. So still very high, but not the same. So there's questions here then about if we are going to separate out into topic streams, is there anything else that we can do to bring people's understanding to an even higher level in terms of what's happening in the other topic streams? And then this point here around equality of access to speakers. So there weren't many Q&A sessions in Scotland's Climate Assembly for various reasons, but what they did have was when they were in the breakout groups, they could call in the speakers to then answer particular questions. And one of the things that we observed was that the groups made use of this in different ways and to different extents. So some groups might not have called in speakers at all. Other groups did it a lot more. And there were all sorts of reasons for that. Some of it was to do with some groups just feeling they were too busy with the task and too focused on the task to then bring a speaker in, which would take time away from that. A variety of reasons, but what it does mean is that there was this inequality then in terms of how the groups used the speakers. And then this last point here around the psychological impact of learning about the severity of the climate crisis. So I think this is a really important consideration for other climate assemblies to fully take on board. We know already from other research that's been published, and it will also be discussed in more detail in our report, that around 2/3 of people in Britain, and that rises to about 72% in Scotland, feel very worried about climate change. And in our work, in our member studies, there was about a fifth consistently who were feeling overwhelmed. That was largely to do with, the amount of information that they were being given, but also difficulties in then processing that information. And then, as I said, there were these few, it was around an average of about 7% who were also reporting that what they felt about climate change was having a negative impact on their mental health. So these are really important aspects for climate assemblies to consider and to factor into the design as well. So I am now going to pass over to Stephen, who will talk about Climate Assembly UK.
So much, Nadine, and I'm just going to give a general overview of the process and also the research without really going into the detail. I posted a link in the chat to the research report for those who are interested in more detail, and there's also an executive summary there if you're just happy with an overview but you don't follow everything I say now. Nick, thank you for your questions you've been posting in the chat, some really excellent questions, and what I think I'll do is I will refer to them when I get to relevant bits of my talk and answer that, and then if there's some I don't address or that you want to come back to, you can do so after the talk. We're going to save time for Q&A. If others want to post questions into the chat, you please do so, or you can wait until the end and ask them, whichever you prefer. So yeah, Climate Assembly UK then, it was the first nationwide citizens assembly in the UK, and it's the first nationwide climate assembly in the UK. And it's very different to the Scottish Climate Assembly that we've just been hearing about, because that was initiated by government. It was approved by the Scottish Parliament and legislated for by the Scottish Parliament, but it was a proposal put forward by the Scottish Government. This, in contrast, was set up by 6 select committees from the House of Commons listed there. What is a select committee? Well, each government department has a corresponding select committee in Parliament that follows its activities, that scrutinises its activities, that is basically trying to hold it account. A select committee is made up of cross parties, so not just one party, but cross parties as in the proportion that they are within the House of Commons itself. So this was an activity to try and hold the government to account on climate change, given it had made a pledge to achieve net zero by 2050. And therefore, that was the remit they decided to give to the Climate Assembly UK as well. The same that the government had set itself. How can UK achieve the government's legally binding target of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050? So there were 108 randomly selected members of the public from across the UK. They met 3 times in person in a hotel in Birmingham. There were initially going to be 4 in-person weekends. Then COVID pandemic came just before the 4th weekend. So after a short pause, it resumed online. And that was very impressive how quickly they actually managed to get it up and transfer it online. And because participating online is considered to be a bit more intensive, and that might be something that you feel as well, for having all been on a lot of online meetings, I guess, and sessions over the last 18 months, that it was split across what would have been one weekend was split across 3 weekends, with those sessions being shorter. As with the Scottish Climate Assembly, they were split into topic groups or different streams: how we travel in the home, what we buy, and land use, food and farming. These came from Parliament. These were the priorities of those 6 select committees mentioned there, which is why those topics were picked. So Nick, your first question in the chat is, did they get to choose which group they were in? In neither the Scottish Climate Assembly or the UK one did they get to choose. Rather, they were allocated, and they were allocated to try and have a representative group in each topic group based upon attitude towards climate change at the start of the process. You asked if whether they got to learn about them, what happened in the other groups. They did, but very minorly in the UK Assembly. It was notional really, but more substantively in the Scottish Climate Assembly. Whether it was substantive enough is another issue, but it's certainly more substantive than in the UK Assembly. So there was an organisation contracted to run the Climate Assembly, an organisation that does political participation events. And they were supported and advised by a set of expert leads. These were different people selected based upon their expertise around climate change. And they advised on what information needed to be provided to the Assembly members, how it should be provided. They provided a lot of the information themselves. There was an academic panel that advised on the same things, and an advisory panel which is more stakeholder based to make sure they're tasked with making sure all the different perspectives that you might want Assembly members to be given were included in the Assembly. But these three bodies were advisory bodies, not decision makers. So that's basically the overview of the process itself. Now an overview of the research. So similarly to the research on the Scottish Climate Assembly, we've done a mixed method study for the reasons that Nadine outlined. So we've got several different data sources. We've surveyed the Assembly members, the witnesses that gave information into the process, and the general public to see if they're aware of it and what they think of it. We've had interviews with some of the Assembly members, the organisers of the Assembly, staff and MPs based in Parliament, and government civil servants from the different relevant ministries most likely to act on climate change issues. We've done a content analysis. This is where you apply some sort of like a framework of different codes to sort of documents or recordings or transcripts. So we've done a contents analysis of the discussions within the Assembly. Remember at the beginning I was saying that they should be facilitated to promote the norms of deliberation. Well, we can't assume that happened, so we looked to see how deliberative that they were. And also we did a content analysis of the media coverage of the Assembly. So what did the media think about it? How much were they covering it? When did that coverage happen? Were they being positive and negative about it, etc.? And finally, non-participant observations. So that just means someone from the research team was there to observe all sessions. And the reason why we have these multiple data sources, the strength of the mixed method study, is that any one data source and any one approach to research has inevitable limitations. But by combining them with other different data sources and other methods, you can at least ameliorate those limitations, mitigate those ameliorations to a certain degree. And it can give you, we call it triangulation, that if different data sources suggest the same thing, then as a research finding you can hold that more concretely. So if you survey people and they suggest one thing, if you interview a different group of people and they say the same, and you've watched and observed and you thought it too, then you can perhaps hold that more concretely. Similarly, if these data sources conflict and start telling you different things, then it helps you raise more research questions that you might say, well, we need further evidence, and it can help research further down the line as well. Okay, so on to the next. So these are the key findings. So we're interested in two broad research questions, kind of what happened in the Assembly and what happened outside of the Assembly. So what impact did the Assembly have on the UK political system, climate governance, climate debate, etc., etc. So firstly, what happened inside the Assembly? So the first thing is they achieved one of the main goals, which was to recruit a diverse group of the public. They were diverse in terms of demographics, in terms of age, in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of levels of education, etc., etc. And in terms of where they come from all different parts of the UK, some rural, some urban. And also importantly, and this is not always done, is that they were recruited based upon their attitudes towards climate change. And this meant that you had people who were climate change deniers, people who aren't convinced that human activity is driving climate change, other people that are but not see it necessarily as a priority, aren't overly concerned, etc., with all the way through to people who are like, oh my word, this is an emergency, we need to do something about it. And it brought all those people, those diverse views into dialogue together. just take a moment to think about that, in the sense that where else in the political system do we get that kind of conversation going between people with those views about an issue like this. And also I mentioned that we analysed the actual conversations that happened as well, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that they were deliberative, but certainly in terms of inclusion, that people weren't being excluded from the discussions, more or less people were having an equal opportunity to have their say, and respectful, people were very respectful towards each other and to the views that other people held. Remember the importance of that, given the diversity of views, certainly at the starting point of the assembly. Where they struggled more was in terms of justifying their demands, and this is a common thing in my research on public deliberation. From the that's the bit of deliberation that people find hardest. That's not to say there weren't justifications there. People were justifying their views, perhaps just not as much as they were being, the discussions were inclusive and respectful, for example. Now, we've said that they're given information about climate change. Did they learn from that information? And the evidence suggests that they did, that they learned from the experts, but they learned from each other as well. And we examined this by asking them, do you feel you know more? And they said that they did, and where they thought the key points of learning had been. But we also asked them some factual questions about climate change and decarbonisation, and the number of correct answers increased from by the end of the assembly compared to the beginning of the assembly. Nick, one of your questions in the chat was about whether this can lead to more engagement than, say, for example, having a carbon literacy course at work. And although that's not covered in the slide, it is covered in the report, in the sense that absolutely the participants felt more confident in participating in politics at the end of the process. They felt more confident that the political system would be willing to listen to them as well. So that's important, because I mean, going back to the quality of deliberation, as I said, these people are not necessarily people who are experienced at participating in politics. And interestingly, in terms of deliberative quality, when the conversations moved online at the end of the assembly, the quality of deliberation went up. Often it's considered to be a more difficult format to have good quality deliberation, but actually improved. Now, I don't think that's because it went online. I think it's just because the online sessions came at the end of the process, and they developed these skills as the process came along. What we don't know, Nick, is how long these changes last for, but we have done a follow-up survey with assembly members like a year on, but we haven't got round to analysing that yet, but that will at least show a little bit the longevity of these kind of changes, which we know less about. A lot of the research sort of ends at the end of the assembly, and that's something that needs to change, I think. So they learn as well as deliberated. Did the learning affect their views on the issue? And again, it seemed to be many assembly members thought that achieving net zero is more achievable by the end of the assembly than they did at the beginning. And then the recommendations. Now, I'm not a climate scientist, so I'm not in a position to review the recommendations and assess whether they could get us to net zero or not. But at the same time, I don't think you need to be a climate scientist to look at the recommendations and see they're more ambitious than current government policy, so that if they were implemented, whether they're enough, they would take us further along that journey than where we are currently. On which you also asked whether things like this undermine, government policy. I mean, they are advisory, so it's up to the government, but whether they accept the recommendations or not. And we're going to go on to see that they haven't done really. So in that sense, they're not undermining it. But the suggestion is, but by some, is that specifically with this issue of climate change, is that politicians are always looking to the next election to win that next election. So they have to respond to public opinion as it is right now. They have to respond to media coverage of the day, and therefore longer term issues like climate change can get overlooked. Whereas this type of body, because it's selected through, the random and stratified sampling that I mentioned, they can perhaps don't have those electoral incentives that might discourage them from looking at longer term issues. Okay, so then that's what happened inside the Assembly. What happened outside the Assembly? This is a bit less positive, unfortunately. So it was always going to be a challenge for the Assembly to have a big influence, because it was commissioned by select committees, not by government, and therefore the government were never going to feel duty bound and to respond. It was debated in Parliament, which is no completely insignificant thing. It's not easy to influence debates in Parliament, but perhaps the aspirations for the organisers would have been greater than that. The Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Select Committee, these were the main sort of initiators of it. I know it's 6 committees, but this was the leader, I would suggest. They've held an inquiry on what the government response to the Climate Assembly UK has been. This is a smart move, because while the government isn't required to respond to the Climate Assembly, all governments are required to respond to select committee reports. So the fact they had a report, and it meant the government had to respond and say what its response was going to be. It can be quite a notional response, and to a degree it was, but at least that they were asked to respond. Part of the uptake by the select committees themselves was hindered by the fact that there was a general election in between it being commissioned and started. This means you've got a new makeup of Parliament, different proportions within the parties, which then reflects different proportions in the committees, different committee chairs, different committee members. And I think they felt less invested in the Assembly because they hadn't initiated it, to be honest. So that has produced its impact. And it's hard to predict these things. We've got a Fixed Term Parliament Act at the moment. We're meant, not for much longer, but we're meant to only have elections every 5 years. But obviously, we've had 3 since 2015. So it's hard for people to avoid elections as well, or it can be. What about the impact on government? That's been limited. Part of the reason for that was the split in the Assembly into thematic groups, in the sense that when we spoke to the civil servants who advised the ministers were saying, right, so have 100 people recommended we do this, and they were like, well, no, actually, because they were split, so it was actually 30 people, or actually it was 20 people out of the 30 that voted for this recommendation, and it just loses its impact. The government feel less impetus to have to respond to that than they do to 100 people have spoken with one voice, and this is what they want you to do. How is it portrayed in the media? I mean, these type of citizens' assemblies do not get much media coverage in the UK, but elsewhere as well, I think it's fair to say in general. This one got some, so probably more than most. And that's partly to do with the strategy of the organisers. They got David Attenborough involved. He came and attended one of the dinners and things like that. And obviously he's a very high profile figure with a close associate into this issue. And there was media coverage there, and in general, the media coverage was either neutral or positive. It got more positive as the Assembly proceeded. It became more mixed in terms of what it was focusing on. So at the beginning, it was very much explaining the process. I guess they didn't have much else to say on it, so that's reasonable. But by the end, it was much more talking about the issue of climate change and the process of the Assembly as well. And I think that combination between the two is a good thing. But it didn't lead to much public awareness or knowledge about the Climate Assembly. So public awareness was low, engagement with the Assembly as a result was low, and that remained pretty much constant through the process. Nick, I know that was one of your questions as well, is how to engage the broader public. And I think that's a really important thing. I don't think 100 people is enough. I think these things are good at trying to inform public opinion, inform public debate, not just leads politicians and policy. And without that broader public awareness, clearly that's not going to happen. I think really the media will only go big on reporting on something like this if it has an influence on policy. But the other problem is, and this is another reason why it didn't have much impact on government, is when we spoke to government, they said, well, the public aren't aware of it. It's just too easy for us to ignore it. You know, whereas if the public were aware of it and saying, right, we want government to do something about it, they'd feel more impetus. So it's kind of like a deadlock. The public are only really going to get to hear about it if it has influence, and yet it's only likely to have influence if the public are aware of it. And I think that's a problem, not just for this assemblies, just climate assemblies and citizens assemblies and many other aspects of politics in general. Okay, so, sorry, next slide, thank you. So drawing on basically the two cases, as Nadine says, there'll be more findings about the Scottish Assembly to come, but I think these findings are still reflective of what we've learned from both cases today. So I think the Citizen Assembly model does work on the climate change issues, and Nadine has suggested it's an issue of such scope, of such complexity, that involves every aspect, level of governance, every aspect of life, every aspect of policy. And yet, you know, the citizens' assemblies have done a good job of addressing the climate change issue. There's things that can be learned, there's things that can be done better, and there are challenges. And one of the key challenges that we've seen in both is the scope of the climate change issue and then the time made available to address it. And there have to be trade-offs there and perhaps new ways of doing things. So both went for the option of the thematic groups to enable deeper learning from some on a certain topic, but that compromises the broader learning about the issue as a whole and that more holistic thinking that is perhaps required to address something like climate change. There are challenges about doing online assemblies. The Scottish one was entirely online, the UK one partially online. Certainly, I think people enjoyed it less. The facilitators found it harder, more challenging. It's harder to get information presented that way. But at the same time, these things were done reasonably well, and also the quality of the deliberation and discussions was good. We're still yet to analyse that aspect of the Scottish Assembly, but we will. But in the UK Assembly, like I say, it actually improved online. I think both processes have been quite top down. You know, the remit has been decided for them. The evidence they're going to be given has been decided for them. How that evidence is going to be given has been decided for them. How they'll reach their decisions has been decided for them. And yet in both assemblies, there were elements that the members got to have a say on, and they did that very well. And so I think we need to roll that out and do much more of it and allow assembly members to determine things for themselves more. So I'd like to see more democratizing elements within not just climate assemblies, citizens assemblies more generally. As Nick's mentioned in the chat, then I think we need more broader public engagement. So this can be at the beginning, this can be in terms of suggestions for the agenda, this can be during the process in terms of submitting evidence or views. You could have processes co-running alongside it, like in the first Citizens Assembly in Canada on electoral reform. The Assembly members each went to visit their local area and held public hearings and public meetings there so they could get the views of the public, but they could also explain the process a bit to them. There's a global climate assembly going on at the moment, and they're encouraging people to organise their own event and process and feed into that. So there's lots of different ways of doing it, and I just think we need to do more of it and experiment more. That's not something that's been practiced that much. And at the end, with the outcomes, you know, producing a report, this isn't the way to engage the public. We need to be much more creative in thinking of ways of how to get this information out there to people. Also, I'd like to see these institutionalized. These are both processes that I would call ad hoc, in the sense that, you know, they're effectively one-off, and And I think if we institutionalize them, if we have rules and laws about when we have a citizens' assembly, about its relationship to government, about how government should be required to respond, about what the source of funding might be and where that funding would come from. If all those rules are in place and are more embedded in the political system, I think they're less open to sort of control by political elites. I think their prominence in the political system can be raised and public awareness can be enhanced as well. So Nadine, unless you've got anything you want to add, I think we are moving to questions. Thank you for listening to us.